remote than it may sound at first. It is being established progressively now. Modeled in Europe, where once mighty nations that oversaw empires such as Britain and Spain are becoming more like provinces of the European Union. Parliaments of EU countries grow increasingly subservient to the European Parliament. Laws are becoming more uniform throughout the Union. National currencies are consolidating into the euro. The European Court of Justice can issue arrest warrants against citizens of member countries. Advocates of world government are planning a universal version of the EU model for the entire planet.
When you give up your identity as an individual nation, what you're essentially doing is giving up the identity of your people and the individuals within your society. Now they're just part of this kind of globalist worldview, and they don't have value anymore. So when we see what's happening in the Veneto region, when we see Scotland now saying that they are looking for independence, when we see Catalonia saying they want independence, if you believe in individual liberty, you should celebrate those movements, because what those entities are essentially saying, as people, as individuals, we believe that we're more than just a member of your larger European Union, your larger global union, and instead we want to be able to create goods and services, be paid for our labor, be paid for our work, and if we have to pay taxes, we should see a return on those taxes within our own communities. In a globalist world, you never see that return.
Globalists justify world government by promising peace and prosperity. Their traditional argument has been that nothing is worse than war. And wars occur because the world is divided into nations who keep fighting. They say if we replace nations with a world government, war would end. And mankind would live as one happy family in peace and prosperity. However, this pretext is flawed. Rudolf Rummel, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Hawaii, published a study demonstrating that in the 20th century, 6 times more people were killed by their own governments than by wars. In other words, wars are not the deadliest thing. Governments are.
What we know from the 20th century, that in nation after nation after nation, governments that became extraordinarily powerful had a very disconcerting tendency to kill their population. So you can look, for example, at the Soviet Union. Under Stalin, 60 million people killed. You can look at China under Mao Zedong. Some estimates say well over 100 million people killed. Some even say 200 million people killed. You can look at Nazi Germany as the example that probably most viewers are familiar with. Example after example, even ones that most people haven't even heard of.
The problem with world government is the same problem as with any government. Government is control by force. The more you concentrate that power, the worse it is. You could make the case that world government might be only as bad as local government, but obviously the bigger, the more concentrated that exploitation racket becomes, the greater chance there is for corruption.
All human authority is jurisdictional and limited. So whenever you violate that and you create a regional government and then a multi-regional government and then a global government, by very nature you have squelched and expunged the fundamental tenets and principles of liberty, natural rights, freedom, sovereignty under the states, individuals. It's all gone.
If we had a world government, who would run it? Globalists like to point out that international alliances have defeated dictators like Saddam Hussein. But what if a man like Hussein took over a world government? Today, if a tyrant enslaves a nation, its people may hopefully escape to another country. But if a dictator ruled a world government, where could anyone escape? America's founding fathers recognized the dangers of concentrating power. They therefore split government power into 3 branches. In the Founding Fathers' original vision, the power of the entire federal government would be held in check by the states. Decentralization of power has spared Americans the oppression of totalitarian dictatorships that other nations have known. James Madison, known as the father of the U.S. Constitution, said,
"The accumulation of all power, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny."
If we follow the money to see who is behind the Council on Foreign Relations, it becomes clear that the U.S. foreign policy establishment is intimately linked to Wall Street and the banking establishment. Americans know they have inflation. In 1962, a postage stamp cost 4 cents. Today, 49. A candy bar cost a nickel in 1962, now around $1. Since 1913, the dollar's purchasing power has declined over 95%. Inflation is not inevitable. This graph depicts American price levels since 1665. There was no net inflation for the first 250 years. Inflationary blips occurred as during the American Revolution, War of 1812, and Civil War, when the United States printed large quantities of money to pay for those conflicts. Increasing the supply of money diminishes its value, making prices rise. But notice after the wars, money always returned to its normal value. A dollar was worth the same in 1900 as 1770. During World War I, our currency inflated, but instead of resuming to its normal value afterwards, American dollars, stable for 250 years, began rapidly and permanently losing value. This change came from one factor: creation of the Federal Reserve Bank in 1913.
The Federal Reserve is the most important part of the American government's racket of exploitation. And that's important to remember, that it's not about the wars, it's not about the police state, it's not about the business regulations. Those are all how. The why is power and money.
Time to pay attention, because the Federal Reserve has taken over the engine of the country and completely made it subservient to interest other than the actual country.
First off, it's not federal, and second off, it has no reserves. Okay, so the whole thing's a fraud to begin with.
The Constitution gives the Congress the power to coin money, but we've lost that by giving our power to a private corporation.
Janet Yellen is current chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. She was preceded by Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan. The Fed chairman has been called America's economic czar, largely because the chairman and board set U.S. interest rates, which impacts the stock market. If interest rates rise, CDs and other interest-bearing securities appear more profitable, causing money to flow away from the riskier stock market. However, when interest rates fall, investors tend to favor stocks.
Janet Yellen, the Fed chair, the new Fed chair, is going around saying that she will continue these policies of this quantitative easing, as it's called, which is essentially just the printing of money. And they're going to continue it until they can get the unemployment rates down. And she gives examples. She's talking like a president now, giving examples of the young woman that she's met in this community who struggles because she works multiple jobs. She's a single mom, and it's very difficult for her. Yeah, well, I'm sure it is difficult for her. But what no one ever tells you in media is that the reason that we have so many people struggling in this country is due in large part to the Federal Reserve Bank.
People who are closest to the money are the ones who get the greatest benefit. So whoever has had their hands on not just the Federal Reserve, but the whole infrastructure around it, the global banks that are peddling the Federal Reserve notes and the bonds and the Treasury bills and so on, the Goldman Sachs of the world, the JP Morgans and so on. These companies and these individuals have consistently gotten rich beyond anybody's wildest imagination. The rest of us consistently have gotten poorer beyond our wildest imagination as well, so that the value of the dollar today is somewhere around 1.5% of what it was in 1913.
You know, the United States dollar, the Federal Reserve note dollar, has lost 98% of its value in the last 100 years. So if, number one, your first mandate is to protect the value of the currency, you failed. The second mandate on unemployment, as I mentioned, when the Fed chair is talking about this family that's in need and she wants to help them, how does the Federal Reserve help them? By holding interest rates low? That doesn't help families. That doesn't put food on my table. If anything, it makes it more difficult because there are more people out there saying, well, then you should go get a loan right now, borrow more money right now.
As has been stated in history, you know, whoever controls the money controls.
Again, it goes back to the money. It's not a world government, it's the bankers in charge. And again, the distribution of wealth right now in the United States, as everyone knows, is worse than it was at the Gilded Age over 100 years ago.
They are creating currency out of nothing with absolutely no value to it, promising us that, number one, this will lead to greater wealth across the nation, which it's proven it cannot do. And number two, it will also create employment, which it cannot do.
The Federal Reserve has the power to issue and create currency, but this gives it an inside track to give money at very low, if any, interest rates to its member banks, to the members of the oligarchy who control that bank. Meanwhile, it loans money to the country at interest, making incredible profits and making certain that the United States can never be sovereign again so long as the Federal Reserve exists.
Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to one of his friends after he was out of office, he said, whenever public servants are paid by something other than what the people produce, the roles of master and servant are reversed.
With the central bank, everything becomes consolidated in the hands of the few. Goes back to, again, 4 simple words: too big to fail. Central banks, look what they've done. They're robbing the people right in front of everybody's eyes as we speak.
The Fed was established when Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. The original legislation was introduced by Senator Nelson Aldrich, a frontman for the banking community. Few Americans today recognize his name. Nonetheless, many have heard of Nelson Rockefeller, who was Gerald Ford's vice president and long New York's governor, one of America's richest men. His full name? Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, named for his grandfather, Nelson Aldrich. Aldrich's daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., and his son Winthrop became chairman of the Rockefeller's Chase National Bank. When Nelson Aldrich spoke on Capitol Hill, insiders knew he acted for the Rockefellers and their allies. The legislation Aldrich introduced, which became the Federal Reserve's basis, was crafted by several of America's richest bankers. At a secret 9-day meeting in 1910 on Jekyll Island off the Georgia coast. At that time, Jekyll Island was an exclusive retreat for the wealthy elite. In attendance were agents from the world's 3 greatest banking houses, those of John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and the Rothschilds. Acting for the Rockefellers were Senator Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip. Representing the Morgan interests were Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, Henry Davison, senior partner in J.P. Morgan & Company, and Charles Norton, head of Morgan's First National Bank of New York. The most important figure who ran the meeting was the Rothschilds' agent, Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg belonged to a German banking family associated with the Rothschilds, the world's most powerful banking dynasty, who had grown rich by establishing central banks that loaned money to European countries. Its patriarch, Amschel Mayer Rothschild, said, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." In 1901, Warburg immigrated to America intending to establish a similar central bank in the United States. He became a partner in Kuhn, Loeb & Company, the Rothschilds' banking satellite in New York City.
Who controls the Federal Reserve is pretty secretive, but for the most part we understand who controls it, and we know many of the families specifically involved, and it's what's known as the Eastern Establishment, many of the banking houses that have come to dominate the 20th century, and of course the robber barons who became monopolists of the major industries of the U.S.
The Rothschilds had long been allied with America's 2 foremost banking families, the Rockefellers and Morgans, providing the seed money for John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company and helping bail out J.P. Morgan when his firm was financially distressed. The axis of Warburg, Rothschild, Morgan, and Rockefeller and their Wall Street confederates became known as the Money Trust. President Wilson named Paul Warburg vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Benjamin Strong was appointed to run the New York Fed, the system's nucleus. The men who had secretly planned the bank now controlled it. At the time, Congress and the public had no inkling of the Jekyll Island meeting. Paul Warburg's annual salary at Kuhn Loeb had been $500,000, equal to well over $10 million in today's dollars. He relinquished that for a Federal Reserve position that paid $12,000. Warburg knew it would be far more profitable to control America's interest rates and make the stock market